Good to be with you. I love the weeks where we're in between sermon series because then we kind of just get to do cleanup and we get to preach on things that are really to help us in very specific ways. So we just sang the song, How Great Is Our God? And I wonder this morning, just to kick us off, how many of us believe that this morning? Here's the question I have. If God is so great, why don't we always see him doing great things in our life? That's a real question, right? Because that's what some people are here to figure out. They're going, everybody talks about this Jesus. Everybody talks about how awesome God is. But when you look at my life and you look at the way I've seen God work, I see a much smaller God than what the Bible talks about. So what gives? I mean, that's fair, right? Like, it's fair to ask the question, if God is so great, why isn't my life equally as great? There's a story, such a small, kind of odd story in Scripture that I want to jump into. We're going to read it first. I'm going to read all 7 verses, and we're going to jump back at the beginning, and we're just going to take it verse by verse and ask the question, God, how do you display your greatness in my life today? 2 Kings chapter 4. We'll fill in the details in just a moment. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. So some of you were in our Nehemiah study last year. We did a Wednesday night series through the book of Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah, you see Nehemiah having to deal with this same problem, that there are Israelites, God's people, are in debt to other Israelites. And one of the ways they're paying off their debt is by selling their children into bond service to these debt collectors. And so Nehemiah handles this problem systemically. I said we were going to read all the verses and I was going to preach, huh? We got like 2 verses in. Nehemiah deals with this systemically, and here Elisha is dealing with this personally and relationally, and God deals with it both the same way. So this is what's going on, that they're selling their children into bond service in order to cover their debts, which means even before her husband died, they had money problems, right? They're already in debt. And so she goes to him and she says this, and Elisha replies, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Okay, what do you have? Do you have anything to sell? What are we going to do about this? And she said, your servant has nothing there at all, except for a small jar of olive oil. And Elisha said, go around and ask all of your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. You guys reading the King James, New King James, borrow not only a few. We're not saying get a few jars, we're saying a lot of jars. Then go inside and shut the door behind you, and you and your sons, it's important that your sons are there, pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him, and she shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your son can live on what is left. That's our text this morning. That's what we're going to work through. So let's just remind ourselves who is talking, what's going on here. So Elisha is the prophet of God. He is God's man in this time period. So when God speaks to the people, before they had the written word, before they had the Old and New Testament the way we have today, God was speaking directly through his prophets. His prophets were doing miracles, were doing great things in the name of God. And so God was getting his glory out to the world through godly men like Elijah and then Elijah's protege, Elisha. And so Elisha does a lot of what Elijah was doing, but it's always personal. It's very intimate. It's relational ministry done very well. So Elisha is known as the prophet. This woman comes to her, that comes to him. She says, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and my kids are about to be sold into bond service to cover the debt that he left behind." I feel like this is what, if any of you guys like have a part-time gig selling life insurance, this is your text, right? Because you're just like, what if something happens to you? Who's going to pay for all of your debt, right? Like that's the same pitch every time. Like I've got 2 friends that sell life insurance, and like once a year I get the same pitch. Like, do you have any debts? What's going to happen to you if something were to happen, right? And so this is her situation. Like this is her reality. Her husband has passed. She has no means to provide for herself, and they've got bills that have to be paid. So it's safe to say we are coming into this story just right in to the saddest and toughest and most desperate season of her life. I don't want to throw this away. I want you guys to think about this for a second. You guys have had bad seasons. If you haven't had a bad season, just wait, because God will choose to teach you perseverance somehow, and it's usually by sending you through the wilderness for a little while. This woman has lost her husband, and now she's afraid that she's about to lose her kids. If you've ever lost a loved one, you understand the grief and panic and loneliness and desperation and anxiety that she must be going through, the anger that must be present. If you've ever lost someone close to you, or if you're in her situation, you just lost your husband and you're afraid of losing your kids, songs like "How Great Is Our God" just doesn't cut it, right? Because at that point you're going, really, God? Look at my life. Where have you been? What's going on? Aren't you going to take care of me? God, I've got no other way out. I've been faithful. My family's been faithful. My husband's been faithful. We've served the temple. We've served the Lord. We've worshiped you. And now here I am in this situation. God, why did you let me get here? And if you came here this morning ready to take off the church mask and be honest about what we go through, many of you can admit we've been here. We've been in these situations. The closest person to me that I've ever lost was my brother. He was my brother, and he was also my best friend. And in so many ways, he was my protector and my confidant, and just almost in some ways, no one was closer to me than my brother. And then he passed. And I remember crying out to God, God, how could this be your plan? How could a good and loving God let bad things like this happen? So listen, if you've ever been there, if you've ever had that really tough season like this woman's going through, just let me start with this. God's about to do something really big in her life. Her life is about to change forever, but it almost always starts with a season like this. See, you got to come with the empty vessel. You got to come and go, God, I've got no other options. God, you are my only way out. And so often God's going, I've been waiting for you to hit that point, that low point where you've got nothing else, because that is where I do my biggest work. And so many of us, we're like, I get that. I've been through that season. And God goes, let me take that season. Let's watch what a big God does with small, broken, hurting people like us in our worst seasons. And so she comes to him. She lets him know the situation. They're in debt. They've got no way out. He says, tell me, what do you have in your house? And she gives an answer that comes locked and loaded with 2 built-in excuses. And you have very likely made one of these excuses, okay? So she says, I've got nothing there at all except for a small jar of oil. And tell me this, maybe you're the person who goes, I've got nothing to offer God. God, I'm supposed to worship you. I'm supposed to bow down to you. I'm supposed to dedicate my life to you. Me? Do you know how broken I am? Do you know how worthless I am? Do you know how small I so often feel? God, I've got nothing. I'm in this stuck situation and I've got nothing. And so often, one of the biggest reasons that God isn't doing big things in your life is not because God doesn't see your worth and see your value, but because we don't. Because we just keep coming up to the altar of God going, I've got nothing to give you, so I'm going to give you nothing. Right? And God so often is going, nothing's what I'm asking for. I want your everything. And if your everything is like the lady who only has one coin to put in the offering, and God goes, Jesus says she gave more than all of you. If it's one coin, give that. If it's a small jar of oil, give that. Man, if the only thing you have to give to God is a little bit of sweat equity, give me a call, we'll get you working, right? Like whatever you have, if you're sitting there going, God, I got nothing to offer you, Jesus is sitting there going, that's all I ever asked for. It's just surrender to me. Whatever you have, your nothingness, your brokenness, your cracked and empty vessel, bring me you. In everything that you come prepared with. And if that's baggage, and if that's a mess, and if that's a hurting soul that needs some healing, will you let me do my best work in your most broken state? So often we go, I just got nothing to offer him, right? I don't know who am I to serve in my church? Who am I to share my story? Who am I to serve my city? Who am I to live a life of purpose? I don't deserve a life of purpose. I've made all the mistakes. I've done everything wrong. I've got nothing to give to God, and therefore I don't expect God to give anything to me. See, sometimes it's our lack that we think puts us outside of God's hand of blessing. The other mistake we make, and this one's a little bit more nefarious, this one's a little bit more easy to hide, I guess. And so this one we don't talk about as much. But oftentimes what God asks you for is the one thing that you don't want to part with. She has one thing of value left in her home. And she doesn't know. God has not been blessing her in this current season. She's sitting there going, God hasn't come through with me yet. And now you want the one thing of value that I have? God, I'll give you everything but this. How many of us do that? God, you can have everything I have but this. This is valuable to me. This is for me. This is what I kept. This is my rainy day fund. This is my emergency situation. This is my backup plan. This is what I run to after you let me down again. This is what I use to get myself by after you don't answer that prayer the way I, if I'm being honest with myself, believe you're not going to answer. I had a professor in preaching school. He said something just offhand. You ever hear somebody, actually some of y'all quote me, and so I hear people quote my sermons. I'm like, that was like the most like thrown away line in the whole sermon. Like that's something I said just like under my breath, and that's what sticks with some of y'all sometimes. But I had this, like I say one thing that's stupid and tacky, and you're just like, let me put that in my notes. I had a professor in preaching school. He goes, man, you hear all these people in their prayers with, if it be your will. And he said, so often the reason they say it is because there's a part of them that is only saying that to give God an out because they don't believe that he actually will. Like, God, will you please just save my kid? He's gone far from you, and he's living in disobedience. He's living in immorality, and I'm concerned for his soul. So God, will you just get his attention? Will you save my son if it be your will? And we say if it be your will, not because the way we should say it, going, I might be wrong about this. I might be selfish in this prayer. This might not really be about you and your glory. This might be me praying selfishly, and it might not be your will. That's the right way to say it. But so often we go, I don't really think God's going to do it. But I want to believe in him, so I'm going to give him an out. I'm going to ask him, but knowing that he's not going to, I'm just going to go, well, if it be your will. That way I won't be heartbroken when he doesn't. Right? And so often we do that, man. We have this idea of a small, worthless God that doesn't really do what the Bible promises him to do. And so for that reason, we hold out. We go, God, you can't have the one thing of value that I own. I need that. I need that to get by when you don't come through for me. And so, man, maybe you're the person that goes, I'm not ready to give God my everything because this is mine, this is for me. He can have 99% of my life, but that secret sin that I have, I'm holding on to that for myself. Or maybe you're the person that goes, who am I to have a life of blessing that God promises? Who am I to experience the kingdom of God, the community of God, the presence of God, and the promises of God in my small, messed up life? And so when God goes, man, what do you have for me? So many of us go, God, I've got nothing. I'm too broken. I'm too messy. I got nothing for you. And so whichever one of those you fall victim to, both of those excuses are just built in to that line. God, I've got nothing except for this small jar of oil. And Elisha, knowing who God is, and God does big things with little things so often. The Bible tells us over and over again that God will use the weak to shame the strong, and God will use the foolish to shame the wise. God displays his glory by getting his will done through the small people, the broken people, the desperate people, the forgotten people. And as I look out this morning, as I think about those that join us and watch online, I look around, I go, I see some broken people. I see some messy people. We call ourselves a healthy place for messy people. Some people don't like that. Some people are like, we shouldn't glorify our sin. You know, we shouldn't be proud of our mess. And we're not. We're not proud of our mess. But we are beyond proud of what God does with messes like the messes we've made. And so this is a healthy place for messy people, because what we know is that this is exactly the situation where God does his work. And so when you go to God and you go, God, I've got nothing to give you except for this one thing, don't be surprised when God goes, that's enough. I can do more with that little thing than anyone else could with anything else, right? That's the God we worship. God goes, whatever you have is enough. Whatever little bit that you can scrape together to worship God with this morning, the promise of God, he goes, I can use that. I can turn that into a way to display my glory to the world, so we can offer hope and healing not just to you, but to the people around you as well. Whatever you have to give to God is enough for God to blow your mind with. You just got to give it to him. You just got to surrender it up to God. And so she goes, all I've got is this small jar. And he goes, good, bring it. That's plenty. That's plenty for God to work his miracle. And so he says, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Now, we already read the verses. You guys know what's going to happen. She's going to start pouring the oil into the jars, and the oil is going to continue to pour until every jar that she gathered is full. So here's the question. How many jars do you think she gathered? What do you think? Somebody throw out a number. What do you think? How many jars do you think she got? More than a few, right? 1,000. 1,000 jars. She asked the whole Israelite nation, like, bring me your pottery, right? Who else has a number? What do you think? 25. 25 vessels. Small vessels, big vessels, we don't know. We don't know how many jars, but here's what I know. However many empty vessels she brought is the amount of full jars of oil she had afterwards, right? Now, I've been thinking about how to say this all week. I think here's the best way I can say this. God is not limited by his capability. He's limited by our capacity. It's our capacity to receive it, right? God goes, look, I'm about to do something big in your life. I want to change your life. I want to bless you. I don't just want to forgive you. I want to give you freedom. I want you to have a life that's better than anything you thought that you could have, but you got to bring me the empty jars. And now here's the thing. That's inconvenient. And it's probably a little bit awkward, right? Going to all of your friends and, hey, I'm in need. I've got this, I'm going broke, and my husband just died. I'm going through this situation. Can you bring me over any jars that you have? And they go, you want full jars? You need to borrow some oil? No, empty jars. Bring me all the empty jars. I'll take any of the jars. The literal translation of this says, go and collect jars, especially the empty ones, right? And so I'll take any of the jars, but empty is better, right? Because whatever God's about to fill these jars with is better than whatever you're filling them with, right? Empty jars are preferred here. And so here's the thing. If she's got a little bit of faith, she's probably only getting a few jars, right? She'll ask her closest friends. She'll talk to the people she can really trust. And she'll go, you know what, we're going to test God on that. We're going to see if God comes through this time. And if he comes through this time, then maybe next time I'll just ask all my friends for their empty jars, right? But I don't really know what God's going to do. I say that God's a great God, but I don't know if I've seen that in my life enough. I'm going to hedge my bet a little bit. I'm going to collect 4 or 5 jars, right? Who knows? She maybe collected 4 or 5 jars. Maybe Danny's right. Maybe she collected 1,000 jars. Here's what I know. God's miracle that he's doing here is not limited by God's capability, but by her capacity to receive the miracle. And so she's full of faith. If she's full of the Spirit, if she knows the power of God, if she's ready to see the miracle work, she's going to go get as many empty jars as she possibly can. Because she goes out and she gets the jars, and she starts pouring the oil into the jars. And you notice this, right, in the next verse. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into the jars, and as filled, put it to the side. And so she goes and she does this. They bring the jars to her. She's just sitting there pouring. I don't know what this looked like. I imagine, you pour out the first jar into the other jar, you probably feel a little silly, right? You go, here's a small jar of oil and here's a big vessel, and you just go, like, that's it, right? You just turn it over and you're like, there it is. And then as it fills up and the oil is starting to kind of ooze out. Have you ever poured oil or honey or something kind of thick, kind of viscous out? It starts kind of just oozing down, and the jar gets full. I imagine there's this moment of panic where you go, oh no, and you slide it aside, and you slide another jar under there, and now it's just drizzling. I don't know how long it took, but that vessel did not stop drizzling until the last jar was full. And so she's just sitting there, just letting this oil come down. I imagine she's not moving, right? She's like, don't do anything to mess this up. We're going to sit right here. Bring me another jar. When this one's full, bring me another jar. So her sons are bringing her the jars. The jars are filling up, and she fills up the last one. She goes, bring me another jar. And the son goes, that's it. That's all the jars that we collected. And the oil stopped flowing. Just like that. She didn't run out of jars. Let me say that right. She didn't run out of oil. She ran out of jars, right? God did not allot her a certain portion of blessing. She chose the portion. She decided, based on her faith, how much do I believe this prophet of God? How much do I trust that when God's ready to do a big thing in my life, it's a really big thing? And therefore, how many jars am I willing to collect? She's the one in control of how many jars of oil she ends up with. And what she doesn't know yet about this, what she doesn't realize is that however many extra jars of oil, because the debt is fixed, right? She only owes a certain amount. And the promise is, I'm coming to you with a money problem. I've got this debt. Can you help me with the money problem? And Elisha's promise is, we're going to take care of the money problem. We're going to clear the debt. But depending on how much faith you have is how much you have left over after the debt's paid. Because if you've got a lot of faith and you collect a lot of jars, you're going to have a whole lot of oil, right? James says it really interestingly. He talks about faith and works and the relationship of faith and works. And because Paul's adamant, and you read through Ephesians chapter, you read through Colossians, Paul is big on the idea that we are not saved on our works. We're not saved on what we can produce. We're not saved based on how many jars we can bring to the table. It's not roll up our sleeves, let me try to work hard enough, let me try to do enough so I can pass God's test. So he goes, no, you're saved by grace and faith. That's it. It's your faith and the grace of God. It's trusting God enough to accept the free gift of his amazing grace. That is what you're saved on. You are not saved by your works. That way nobody can boast in themselves and in their ability to save themselves. And that's good for messy people like you, because we don't have enough good works to save ourselves anyway. So thank God that he has a system where we don't have to try to save ourselves by works. And then James comes back in and he goes, okay, that's true, but the works are evidence of the faith. So he says, you say that you will show me your faith without works. He says, I'll show you my faith by works. Because the work I do for Jesus is evident, is the proof of the saving grace that he has already worked in my life. And the same is true for her. If she has faith, if she really trusts God, she gets a whole bunch of jars. And the oil is enough to cover her, to sustain her life going forward. If she doesn't really have faith, if it's just a little bit of faith, then she doesn't put in the work, right? She does less. Like, I don't really have time for that today, Elisha. I don't know if you know, I've got a lot of stuff going on. Like, we just had a funeral for my husband. My kids are trying to work off this debt that we can't afford. And so, look, like, we're stretched thin. We're exhausted. I don't really have time for that right now. And so I can't put in that much work. See, if you don't have faith, you don't do the work. And if you have a whole lot of faith, you're willing to put in the work because you trust when God says he's going to do something big in your life. And so she collects the jars of oil. When she runs out of empty vessels, the oil stops flowing. She goes back to him. Can you imagine that before we move on? You just sit in that for a moment, just think about that. What that would be like to be sitting there holding that. Have you ever had those moments where you're praying for something? And a lot of times we look back in our prayer life and we go, you know what, I used to pray for that. And then God blessed me, and he answered that prayer. But every once in a while, you're like in the moment. Like you're aware this is God answering the thing that I've been praying for. Have you ever had that moment where the presence of God is just palpable in your life? Like you're looking around and you're going, God is working. Like, I don't know if you've had those worship moments. You're looking around at your church family, or you're in a small group, or you're reading the word, or however it is, you just feel the presence of God. I don't know if you've had those moments where you're realizing, you're just like, man, God is big, and he's working, and he's doing more than I ever thought he would do. Don't miss those moments where you can feel the presence of God. She knows that moment. She is in the midst of a miracle. And you can hear it in the tone change in her language, because she goes back. She went and told the man of God. This is one of those things that I don't catch. I did not take Hebrew when I was in seminary, because that was like a 6 a.m. class, and it was optional. So that's just asked and answered, right? Do you want an optional Hebrew class at 6 in the morning? Optional? No, thank you. So I didn't take Hebrew. I depend on Hebrew scholars that are way smarter than me to point this stuff out. What I never would have noticed, that most scholars agree on, is the first time he's addressed by her, it's Elisha, right? Elisha, who works with my husband's dad, right? Like, that's the situation. Her husband is the son of the prophets, where Elisha is like the prophet, right? And so that's kind of the relationship that they have. Elisha. Here, the tone changes. The point of view shifts. Her perception of what's happening is now different, and she addresses him as the man of God. You ever have those situations in your life where there's just no doubt, like, God is working in my life? And when you do that, man, everything becomes a God thing, right? Like, you start seeing the connections, and you start realizing God is doing bigger things than I deserve, and bigger things than I even thought possible. And so now it's not just Elisha, now it's a man of God. And she's making it about God. She's giving the glory to God. She's recognizing this is not done by human hands, that this is a miracle of the creator of the universe divinely working in my life to right a wrong that I likely caused myself. That's insane, but that's the promise. The promise is the God of the universe is willing to bless your life in such a way that you make the mess, and then you surrender it to him, and he goes, watch what I do in messy situations like yours for my glory, so that you walk away going, that was God. And those are the people of God. And this is the word of God. And that Elisha guy, that's the man of God right there. And so I don't know if you just had those moments. Like you have your lowest season, and God goes, I'm going to take that low moment and send you to the mountaintop because of that. And so many of us, he's like, you got to go through it. You got to go through the tough season. You got to go through the worst season of your life so that you are equipped to steward the blessing that I would have given you, but couldn't give you until you're ready to surrender to me. And so she says, he's a man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. That's my favorite part of this entire text. Because the debt is going to be what it is, right? But the portion left she now gets to live on, that is entirely the amount of faith that she started out with. If she had a lot of faith, she collected a lot of vessels, she now has a lot of oil, she doesn't just have her debts paid, she's got a business, she can sell that oil, she can bless other people, she can live off of that. She now has freedom. So think about this, because she went into this situation going, man, we've been struggling, and we've been stretched thin, and it feels like we get the bills paid, but it feels like we're just getting further and further behind. Am I talking to anybody this morning? You guys know what I'm talking about? It feels like we just keep working ourselves to the bone, and like we're getting by, and life is okay, but like it's leaving marks, right? Like we're tired, and we're exhausted, and we're stretched thin, and it feels like we're getting by, but we're not getting ahead. I know so many people, so many Christians, so many Christ followers that are getting by, but they're not getting ahead. And they've been getting by long enough that before this person died, they had debt. And so here they are with this debt, and they're making it, but there's no way out. And they just feel like they're drowning, and so they're just in this situation. And she's coming to Elijah. She's not asking to have that situation fixed. She's just asking that her sons not get sold in the bond service because the debt's too big. She's going, man, if I can just, I'll go back to the grind. I'll go back to the daily struggle of just making ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck. I just got to get past this debt. And there's I know some of y'all, I've had seasons in my life, like we know that struggle, right? God, if I can just get over this hump, then I'll just grind it out. I'll work hard and I'll do what's necessary. I'll do whatever I can just to get by. And what God does in this situation is he goes, I don't just want to pay the debt. I want to set you free. I'm not just here to forgive what you owe. I want to give you a better life than you had going into it to begin with. And so he says, pay your debt down. But the measure of faith that you have is the measure of blessing that you have left over. He goes, that's what you get to live on. The Christian life is not just about Jesus paying our sin debt. It's also about the life afterwards. I don't know if we talk about that enough, because I think there's a lot of Christians that have this idea. It's like the goal is to get saved. Like if I became a Christian, and now I just get to coast and kind of do whatever I want. And as long as I go to church on Sunday morning, except for Super Bowl Sunday, I actually didn't know. Cassie texted me yesterday. She goes, "Hey, just the Super Bowl tomorrow." I was like, "Really?" And so. No, and then I was on TikTok late last night, and somebody made a reference about the Eagles. So here's what I know. I think the Super Bowl's today, and I think one of the teams is the Eagles. That's as much as I can tell you. That's what I got for you. No idea who the other team is. Good luck, I guess. I don't know. I will say this, though. Those of you that watch for the commercials, there are Christian commercials playing in the Super Bowl, which is not allowed on national networks, but on local networks. And there's a campaign, the He Gets Us movement is buying out local ads all across the nation so that they can talk about Jesus during the Super Bowl, during the commercials, which I think is awesome. We live in the weirdest and most frustrating, coolest time to be a part of a church trying to reach people for Jesus. It's happening in all kinds of ways we never thought was possible. Okay, so y'all are here. Thank you for being here. I know some of y'all got plans, some of y'all got places to be. But look, man, so many of us, let me just bring this back in here. So many of us, we'll just land the plane. Man, we come here and we kind of have this idea, like I got saved, I got baptized, I became a Christian when I was 20, or I was 16. I just turned 16, I think. Late 15 or early 16, right? I was 16 years old, got baptized at 16 years old. What most people do is they go, I became a Christian at 16, and now I just kind of get to do whatever I want, and then I'm going to die and I'm going to be in heaven, right? And the goal is to get saved so you can be in heaven. And what God shows us again and again in Scripture is he goes, what about every day in between? What about every day of your life in between the time you surrendered what you had to Jesus and the time that you died so that you could go be with Jesus? Is every day in between then a life of blessing, a life of kingdom living? Are you living a life of purpose? Are you allowing God to take that small thing in you and turn it into something really awesome so that you can have a life that other people want to know about? Are you shining the light of Jesus by telling people not what Jesus did when you got saved, but what Jesus is doing right now in your life? Like, how many of y'all have enough faith that God's going, I'm not giving you enough to cover your debt. Because of the faith that you have, I'm giving you enough to give you a life. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, he says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is within us. To him be the glory forever. To him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. So God is bigger than your limitations, right? God is willing to do big things. And there's another verse. He says, this is John chapter 10, verse 10. He says, the thief comes just to steal and kill and destroy. But I, the good shepherd, he's talking about what it means to be a good shepherd. He says, I came that you might have life and have life abundantly. An abundant life. That's what God wants. He goes, man, I'm not just trying to save you of your sin debt. I'm trying to give you an abundant life. But the life that comes on the other side of salvation, that's in accordance to the measure of faith that you have. I've been talking about measure for like a month now, that word metron in the Greek in the Bible, that you have works given to you to do to the glory of God in accordance to the measure of faith that you have. So based on how much faith you have is the life that God is going to give you. And you see it here in the text, right? Like, I'm not making this up. Like, he's going, if you only got a few vessels, then you'll have enough oil to pay the debt. But if you have a lot of vessels, you have enough oil to have life after the debt. I didn't come just to forgive you. I came to set you free. I didn't come just to take your sin debt. I came to give you an abundant life after you've been forgiven of your sin debt. And so Elisha tells this woman, he goes, sell the oil and pay the debt, but then everything you have in excess, I want you to live off of that. She went into it struggling to get by with a problem that she couldn't solve, and now she has the kind of freedom where she never has to be in debt again. Isn't that awesome? Because here's the thing, how many of you guys want that kind of ending? How many of you guys like, God, work a miracle so big in my life that I am set free, that I don't have to go through this again. I don't keep running back to the same stupid sin struggles that I find myself drowning in time and time again. God, can you just help me get to that place where I'm just not struggling over this foolishness anymore? And God's response, he goes, man, I have that life for you. I've got those blessings for you. But it's in accordance to your faith. Will you give me everything? Will you take whatever it is that you have? Will you surrender it to me in such a way that you came in with a debt, but you're leaving with a life after the debt? She would have been happy, man. She would have been happy if she could just forgive that debt. She can go back to just grinding it out. But God goes, no, it's bigger than that. I've got a bigger blessing. If you've got the faith for it, to the measure of faith that you have, if you're willing to collect enough vessels, if you come to me with enough empty vessels, if you're willing to surrender what you have to me, I'm not just trying to forgive your debt, I'm trying to give you freedom. And he sets her and her sons free to live a life full of mercy and full of grace. And what I love about it is it literally is more than what she asked or imagined. She asked for her debt to be paid, and he goes, I'm going to give you more than that. More than, I'm capable of immeasurably more than all you ask or imagine. And so he says, go and sell the oil, pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on what is left. And I hope you know, I think most of you know, but in case we don't say it enough, I hope you know Jesus wants the same thing for you. He goes, man, you've got a debt. All of us are sinners. All of us have a sin debt, and none of us are good enough to pay our own debt. And if you're not a Christian, if you haven't surrendered what you have to Jesus, if you haven't given your life to Jesus, if you just given that up to him and say, God, I'm putting my faith in you. I like your plan better than my plan. I keep trying to do things my way, and I keep crashing and burning, so I'm just going to surrender to you. I'm going to put my faith and my trust in you. And he goes, great, you trust me? You're ready to work for, you're ready to collect some vessels? Good. I want you to die to that old life. I want you to die to that life of grinding and getting by and struggling and worshiping this very small God that doesn't bless and doesn't really do big things. Do you really have faith? Do you have faith for a bigger life? Do you have faith for a better life? Do you really want God to give you an abundant life? He says, then the promise is, I'm not just going to forgive your debt. I'm going to give you freedom on the other side. He makes the same promise. He goes, man, you've got a sin debt. And that sin debt must be forgiven. If you want relationship with God, if you want to go to heaven when you die, and some of y'all are here because of that, right? Like some of y'all are here this morning because somebody told you if you don't go to church enough, God's going to send you to hell, right? No shame in that. I got saved. I became a Christian, went into the waters of baptism because I had a moment in my life where I became very aware and terrified of the hopelessness that must be eternity away from God. The more I understood what hell must be like, the more scared I was. I remember I called Janae. I was a teenager. I called Janae in the middle of the night. I go, hey, tomorrow can I get baptized? Can you take me to the baptistry? I want to get baptized. And she goes, yeah. What changed your mind? I go, I just had the most realistic nightmare about hell that I ever could have had. And I remember telling her. I didn't plan on talking about this, but here we go. I remember telling her, I felt hopeless, and it didn't feel like a dream. I was convinced I was never going to wake up, that this was my life, that I was in hell for eternity. And I remember telling her, I don't want that. I'm terrified of the wrath of God, and I want to give my life to him. And so I went into the baptistry because I had a sin debt that I couldn't pay myself. That was it. That's all I wanted out of that. What I never imagined is that God would give me more. What I never imagined is that God would slowly teach me through all my pain and all the bad beats and all the messes that I've made for myself, that God would slowly teach me that his way is better than my way, that the Bible's way is the best way, that his life is better than whatever life I could dream up for myself. And the more I put my faith in him, the more I discovered and am discovering that God doesn't just want to forgive me, he wants to give me freedom. He doesn't want to just forgive my debt. He wants to give me life after that. And he wants the same thing for you. So some of y'all, maybe you're here because I don't want to go to hell. So I show up to church, and I show up 3 weeks out of the month because I think that's just good enough to kind of slide into heaven when I die. And I put, I don't really tithe, but I put just enough in the plate that I think God will be like, I wouldn't say well done and faithful sermon, but like good enough faithful. Like some of y'all, that's what y'all are aiming for. You're just like, what I'm after is forgiveness. And God's like, what I want to give you is freedom. The reason, let me tell you the reason I'm preaching this, and then we'll be done. Our church culture, I believe, worships a God that's a little bit smaller than the God of the Bible. And you see it in the scarcity mindset that we have sometimes. You see it in the mentality of people. The people that they go, I don't really think God will, or we can't do that, or we don't have enough to do that. We don't have enough people to do that. We don't have enough money to do that. We don't have enough resources to do that. And so often our ministry and our worship and our service to God is limited because we feel like we don't have enough to bring to the table. And God's going, man, just bring me empty vessels. I'll fill them. I'll fill the vessels. Bring me the empty vessels. Bring me the broken and the cracked and the hurting vessels. Bring me all the vessels that go, God, I got nothing to offer you. And God's like, I'll fill the vessels. You just got to have faith to show up. Bring me the vessels. Let me do the work, because I'm not just trying to forgive you. I'm trying to give you freedom. God wants to give you so much more, immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine. You just got to trust him with it. Put your faith in him and watch what God does in your life. The question I keep having, man, is you look around, what God's doing in the kingdom today. And when we start making excuses like, well, we're not that church, we can't do that. The question is it because God's not capable, or is it because we're limiting God's capabilities? Is it a question of God's capability, or is it a question of our capacity? How much blessing can you stand? How much love of God working, doing amazing things in your life do you have eyes to see? Because if you will open your eyes, if you will trust him, God, I don't just want to be forgiven. I want a life. I want an abundant life in service to you. The only response to you goes, bring me what you have. Well, God, I don't have anything. I'm broken. I'm broke. I'm poor. I'm beat up. I'm so tired. I don't have anything left to serve. I've been serving for too long. And God goes, bring me what you have. That one thing that you have, that one small jar of oil, that's enough. That's enough to get the oil flowing. I can do something with that. I can do so much with whatever you have. I am not limited by my capability, only limited by your capacity to receive it. So will you receive it? Will you let me do something amazing in your life? To have a story like that, to have a story that ends that way, it almost always has to start like that. You got to go to God going, God, I can't buy my way out of this. I can't fight my way out of this. If my life changes, it's because you did something big in my life. And some of y'all, you're just not ready to do that, but I think some of you are. Some of you are at that point where you're like, God, it's for you and it's about you. I can't do it on my own, so I'm giving it all to you. Some of you, like, you just need to hear, you don't have to be good enough. You don't have to have enough. I know you feel like nothing. I know you feel like an empty vessel. And I know you feel like, but God, can I really trust you with that? I've been hurt. And the promise is, not only will I forgive you, but I'll give you freedom. Not only will I pay the debt that you couldn't do, not only will I send my son to the cross to pay the debt that you can't afford to pay on your own, that you're not good enough to pay on your own, but there will be so much blessing in that I will give you a life of purpose and presence on the other side of the pain. You've just got to surrender it to me. I just want to ask you, if you're ready to do that, if you want to give your life to Jesus, will you do that with us today? I'm going to invite you forward. I'm going to come right down here, and if you know that you need life, but you've been holding on to something and you're ready to give that over to him, I just invite you, come forward. We're going to stand and we're going to sing, and if you'll just come forward, I'd like to pray for you. We can do that right now. Let's stand.